Hello, everyone. Welcome into another rendition of the Target Smart podcast. I'm Anthony Sanfilippo, joined as always by Albert Morales. Albert, good to have you back this week. You're looking very dapper today. I like the color of that shirt. That's a good look for you there.
It's my Democratic donkey shirt. It's got donkeys, it's got the U.S. flag, Statue of Liberty, Uncle Sam's hat. Yes, I was excited about. I was almost as excited about wearing this shirt today as I was about having our next guest, Dr. Matt Barreto. I don't want to give him too many accolades because his head will get even bigger than what it already is. But Matt Barreto is, he's as much as anyone has contributed to the success that I've enjoyed in recent years. He found it a good idea to hire me during the 2016 cycle. With his polling firm that he that he started with Dr. Gary Segura, another authority on all things statistics, polling. They are both tenured professors at UCLA, teaching political science, Chicano studies, and all the numbers that I will never make sense of. But he's currently working on a number of projects. You Google him, you'll often find Matt and Gary being the gold standard in Latino polling. And every time around this year, even I shouldn't say this year, but here I guess in more recent cycles, their name ID that we often hear the term used just continues to grow because they get it right. They're known for getting it right. For example, in Nevada, when everyone had written off our late Senator Harry Reid, they were summoned to meet with the senator, and he asked them to give it to him straight. They did. They ran some surveys, and come election day, everyone had already discounted Senator Reid. Some claiming he was going to lose by 3 to 5 points, whatever. Matt and Gary never were worried because they knew that the Latino vote was being undercounted, especially his support. We still see that a lot these days, unfortunately, and a lot of that has to do with, boils down to cultural competency, but we'll get into that as Matt joins us here. So, Anthony, I don't know if you're ready, but I'd like to bring.
We'll send the intern into the green room to go get Matt. Real quick, just want to remind everyone as before Matt pops on here that if you want to subscribe to the Target Smart podcast, please do so on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Pandora, Amazon Music, wherever you get your podcasts, or right here on YouTube if you're watching us. Good to see you. Good to see all your faces. Be sure to hit that like button, subscribe, hit that like button. That really does help the podcast get out there into the more people's eyeballs. But if you do that, and connect with us on X at Target Smart, Facebook Target Smart DC, LinkedIn at TargetSmart.com. And without further ado, thanks to the intern for going and getting them. They ran real fast and got them. Let's welcome Matt Barreto to the program. Matt, good to see you, my friend.
Hey, all right, Anthony, and Farmer Al. For folks who don't know, I knew Albert before he was an actual farmer with 6 horses and 20 cows and however many chickens he has. He used to actually live in the city. People don't probably know that, but he wasn't always a farmer. And he was actually a good data analyst, even though he won't tell you that. He was quite effective and could deliver a PowerPoint presentation better than anyone I ever met. So good to be with you. Good to see you again, Albert.
I'll send you that.
It's fascinating that you say he could do that PowerPoint presentation because, we've had to, when we started this podcast, Matt, he was starting it from his farm. Yeah. And the internet on the farm was so bad. Like we had to make him drive into the city to actually do this thing because he was so far behind, like lagging so far behind. But you make a good point. Like we always have some reference to the farm on every episode. Last week when we had DNC chair Jamie Harrison on, he had the donkeys asking questions of Jamie Harrison. Okay, so this week he's got the donkey T-shirt. We talk about the farm, or the donkey button down. I'm sorry, not a T-shirt. But yeah, we always get the farm references, and so I'm glad you were the one who brought it up today and not me.
Well, it's good to be with you both.
Anthony, thanks for reminding me to follow up with Jamie, because Moonshiner, one of the donkeys before I left, asked me about whether or not the vice president was going to appear on the podcast. So he hasn't gotten back to us.
Oh, wow.
So
Yeah.
we're hoping that'll happen. We got a couple more weeks. But
Yeah, there we go.
Matt, again, welcome to the Target Smart podcast. We've had the good fortune of having a number of really good guests on the program, and you're not the exception. And I think most people in the political space know of you and the work that you've done over the how you say decades. But why don't you share with our audience? We always like to start the program by allowing our guests to give a small summary, a short summary of how you got started in polling. I know it wasn't exactly your plan all along, but go ahead, share with our audience.
Sure, thanks. And it's great to be with you guys. And actually, Albert was one of the first people I actually ever met in Washington, D.C., all the way back in 2007 or 2008. But I was a political science professor. I got my PhD at UC Irvine, University of California, Irvine, studying Latino politics, Latino public opinion, voting patterns. My partner in the business, Gary Segura, was already a professor. I like to remind everyone that he's way older than me. He's definitely an old man, and was really one of the pioneers in our field, if I give him some credit, in statistical modeling and analysis of Latino voting. And I became a professor. We ended up at the same university. Both Gary and I were at the University of Washington, and we were working on a lot of projects together, trying to understand Latino voting patterns. We were very frustrated that what appeared to be mainstream polling, including within academia, our other professor friends and scholars, they weren't getting the Latino Hispanic vote right at all. It wasn't even close. They were still 100% in English. They had very, very few immigrants and second gen Latinos in their samples. They weren't asking the right questions. And so Gary and I set about, not just in our academic work, but then we wanted to bring our scholarly research, our polls, our public opinion analysis into the mainstream. So we started working with folks like Arturo Vargas at Naleo, Clarissa Martinez over at what was National Council of La Raza back then, now Unidos. And we reached out to them. They respected us as academics. And we said, hey, can we do some research with you? Can we help advance your cause? Can we get better Latino public opinion data in the public eye? And those Latino advocacy groups were good partners for us. They helped elevate us. We still had no idea what we were doing when it came to actual campaigns in the Democratic Party. And I remember I think I met you, Albert, at an early Naleo or Unidos or one of those conferences that the big Latino orgs have in DC. And, Albert sort of showed us the ropes a little bit. He said, what campaigns have you worked for? We said, none. We're just two college professors. And, sort of introduced us to folks, told us who we needed to know. And slowly but surely, what I'll say is, our work spoke for itself. The data spoke for itself. We were able to collect what we thought was much more accurate, reliable accounts of our community, making sure we had the right demographics of Latino voters. And eventually people started to become interested in that as the population grew and became more relevant in all the battleground states. And so it's been an exciting ride. We're excited to see what 2024 gives us. We know there's so much attention on the Latino vote this year, and that makes our work more interesting. So that's a little bit about how we got to where we are.
So we're less than 2 weeks out now officially.
Yep.
Thought this day would never come. So it's silly season, but even a lot of the polls the political types that I respect are sending me these questions that come up inevitably every 2 years or 4 years, but they're more pronounced cycle. What gets me the most is that they always start by saying that, man, our 2020 numbers just don't add up to what we're seeing right now. What's going on? Could you put it in layman's terms for folks as to why it's important that we not draw the 2020 comparisons?
Yeah, there's a couple of reasons here. First is the most obvious is COVID, right? I mean, that was just such a atypical election. First of all, because we were pre-vaccine, you have to remember that we were pre-vaccine, people were really rushing to vote early, to vote by mail, to get out of the way so they didn't have to be in the lines on election day. Not only that, the campaigns did not have full ground games in 2020 because it was pre-vaccine, and the Biden campaign in particular, which I worked on, we were not confident in sending out volunteers to go into big crowds and go door to door. So you had a lack of ground, you had a rush to vote early, and so it was just and the issues, were so unique and different. What was going to happen with the economy, with the COVID economy? Was it going to get reopened? When was the vaccine going to come around? Schools were closed. It was so unique that I think in almost every way, 2020 is not a benchmark. We shouldn't benchmark to it at all. It was an extremely effective campaign, almost with one arm tied behind their back for the Biden campaign, not having the usual ground game that Democrats enjoy to win that. And they had a very particular strategy for 2024 is different. It's new. Demographics are changing. And I think that's really important within the Latino community to remember. Don't benchmark our numbers to any other election cycle because probably 1/5, 1 out of 5 Latino voters will be brand new. They didn't vote in 2020. And so we have nothing to benchmark them to. And that's the case, I think, with a lot of the demographics. They're moving around. Democrats are certainly doing much better than they ever have with college-educated whites. Republicans continue to make inroads with non-college whites. So things move. And I think it's a mistake for people to go get the old 2020 numbers and go, oh, look where we were. It's like, well, it's not that election. And this election presents new challenges and opportunities, but it's not 2020.
No, I have to agree there. So when I first met you and Gary, you just mentioned that you were just getting started at least in the political space. But what's been the most fundamental change that you've seen in polling as it relates to qualitative versus quantitative? Quantitative. I think it's very hard now to get people to pick up the phone. That's not breaking news. We've been experiencing that for some time, regardless of who you talk to in the polling space. But as it relates to Latinos, what are the new tools out there that you're using to make sure you meet your quotas?
Yeah, no, it's a changing world. There's no doubt. In the time that we've been collecting, it started with really 100% telephone and even landline telephone when I would go back to the first polls that I was doing in the late 1990s. And then there was big question marks of, can we call cell phones? Should we call cell phones? But what about their home phone versus their cell phone? And are you double counting some households if they have 3 phones? And that was a big mess. Now, of course, we call and text cell phones. So things have changed. It has proven more difficult, I think, for less informed polling outfits to, quote, get it right, because you have to get the sample right. And that has really changed over the years. We still are calling with live callers to phones, even though the response rate is low. There are still people who prefer to talk to another person and give their answers. But there's a lot of text message polling, as we know, where you can answer not in the space of the text. That is growing as well, but that's less proven. But where you click a link and then you take the survey on your smartphone. And then, of course, there's these online panels and online vendors, which are coming around. The good ones work with companies like TargetSmart to pre-match their file to your file and make sure that when they sell me an email address or something, it's a registered voter. There are so many that don't do that, though. And so we have to be wary of that and say, are these just a Russian bot farm that they sent to deploy to come fill out a survey? And you have to have high awareness of your data today and your sample today to make sure, even if it's not bots, if it's just, lazy respondents filling out the survey in their parents' basement, you have to have high awareness of your sample. And so we put an extreme amount of attention into that. We also do intercepts on like Sony PlayStation and YouTube, where you'll be watching or playing a game and you'll get an ad that says, click here to take this survey, and you can opt into some of our surveys. We want to meet people where they are. That's where people are hanging out these days.
Yeah.
We want to meet them where they are. We want to give them an opportunity. And then on the back end, the data scientists have to piece together the sample to make sure it's accurate. Do you have the right number of immigrants? Do you have the right number of college educated? Do you have the right number in the suburbs? You have the right number of people under 30 who will never answer a phone, won't click on a text message. So it is very different. You're exactly right. It's challenging. And I think that's why, just to like give the viewers a little bit of maybe ease, that's why the polls are like this. You know, today on the front page of the New York Times, there was a Trump +3 national and a Harris +3 national. It's not possible. And it's because there's so much noise out there. And I think most pollsters don't emphasize the data science to get it right.
Margin of error and all that, Matt.
Yeah.
Right. That's how it's possible. That's how you explain those discrepancies away. You know, one of the things that you and your company have really specialized in over the years is cultural competency, right? So when you look at the Latino vote, the Hispanic electorate, why is it so difficult for campaigns to really understand the nuance of it at its core when kind of putting their campaigns together?
Well, I think they have gone through a cycle of mistaking Latinos first as non-voters and non-citizens, and in the old days wouldn't even campaign in some of the most heavily Latino barrios because they just thought there were no voters there, to then going in thinking that all Latino voters only spoke Spanish, would only vote for you if you had a full 15-piece mariachi at all your campaign events, and that was the only way. Is the only way that you could get our attention. You know, to then realizing, hey, wait a minute, there's this U.S.-born bilingual, bicultural segment, and then yes, there's also people who are third, fourth, fifth generation families, especially in places like Texas, Colorado, New Mexico, Arizona, who still fully identify as Hispanic or Mexican American or of Mexican descent. And so you have to understand all of that diversity and nuance, and you can't just assume. I mean, when I first started working on campaigns, every single one, and Albert will know this is how things used to run at the DNC. The quote Hispanic desk just meant that was your Spanish language advertising. That was it. And you weren't actually, and it was tiny. It was a tiny budget, and you could maybe do one ad on Univision and one ad on Telemundo, and that was all you could do. And you weren't really communicating with all Latinos. We know that somewhere around a third of our Latino electorate is Spanish dominant and does primarily choose to watch Spanish language media, Spanish language information. Another third never turns that on at all, ever. You know, maybe when they're over visiting their abuela, and maybe it's on in the background. And then there's another third that's in the middle that, yes, watches it, has it on, whether they're watching it for entertainment or sports events that they prefer to watch in Spanish, or maybe still catching 1 hour of noticias from Telemundo or Univision, but also watching in English. So you have to understand that diversity, and most people don't unless you've lived it. You know, if you have that sort of background and you grew up that way, you understand it. And that's what we try to put into our understanding of our data, is that it's a lived experience. And we have everyone from English dominant to Spanish as a first language to lots and lots of us in the middle, bilingual, bicultural at our firm. And we take that approach to data. That's usually the first conversation we have with clients, is trying just to explain to them that diversity and understanding all the nuance and telling them, we want to help you get it right.
Well, I want to follow up on that just for a second, because I'm going to speak to you like a layman who doesn't understand that nuance, and I'm going to say to you, well, gee, Matt, I thought that, you know, when I see these polls and I see, like, you know, the numbers that are coming out, that, you know, all Latinos are put into the one bucket. Like, I thought that that's it. I didn't think that there was any kind of diversity within that. I'm told all my life that it's just the Latino vote and that's it. You know, what more is there to it than just that? Or should we really abandon that at this point? I mean, are we far enough along, you know, with several generations now that have been in the United States of Latinos, that maybe we don't need to just put that all into one bucket anymore, just to get rid of that concept?
Yeah, no, I think I've started trying to transition, instead of talking about, quote, the Latino vote, to be talking about Latino voters, plural, that there's still Latinos, there's still voters, but it's not some sort of singular the. There still are, though, across the incredible diversity, very high percentages of Latinos in other parts of these public opinion surveys who say like, yeah, I feel like we do have something in common across culture, even, you know, Mexican, Central American, Puerto Rican, South American, that there are, you know, commonalities, that there's common culture, music, food, customs, and they do see something in common with each other. But that doesn't mean that, you know, politically, we view the world the same, and that politically you need to reach us in the same way. And the example I always give is that, you know, if you came from a foreign country and you were looking at the election results and you saw all the vote returns from Wisconsin, which is overwhelmingly white, 90% white, and then you thought, this is how white people in America vote, like the way they do, excuse me, not Wisconsin, Vermont. If you just looked at Vermont, is the East Coast state coming in, and you just looked at the Vermont data and you said, oh, this is how white people in the United States vote, like they vote in Vermont. It's like, no, that's one little tiny sliver. It's very unique. And you cannot draw inferences from the way white Vermonters vote to whites in Alabama, Texas, San Francisco, or anywhere, Ohio. And so we're starting to learn that about Latinos. And what do campaigns do? They have different strategies if they're in New Hampshire, which is a competitive state, than if they're in Georgia, which is a competitive state, when they talk to white folks. They have different strategies. So we want that same thing for us. We want to say, like, look, if you're in Miami, if you're in Orlando, you should have a different strategy to talk to Latinos. You still talk to them as Latinos, but it's just like you have a different strategy for your white folks in Georgia and your white folks in middle of Pennsylvania. You should have a different strategy when you're talking to immigrants in Yuma or Tucson in southern Arizona versus Puerto Ricans in Philadelphia City in an urban setting. So that's what we hope is changing. The campaigns that I'm working on are seeing that they're changing. They have like 10 Latino strategies. They don't have a Latino strategy. They have like 10. And that's how a campaign should be. It should be the same thing for white folks, for Black folks, for AAPI. Campaigns need to get more adept at that, you know, diversity and that nuance. And that's what voters want. They want to feel like you're targeting me, not my stereotype.
So Matt, you know, I'm often accused of giving too rosy a picture of where we are with Latinos, but I always try to emphasize that there is precedent for what we're seeing, right? You're seeing Latino support for Trump close to 40. Some will even some may even argue it exceeds 40%. But I always like to take people and dial it back a little bit. There's precedent for this, even with even as early as 2014. Forget going back to 2000 with George W. Bush. But you remember we had the Republicans were smart. They had Latino big names. Governor Sandoval in Nevada, he got over 50% of the Latino vote, if memory serves me. Susana Martinez in New Mexico. That was a terrible year for Democrats, but I don't think that matters. I think the fact of the matter is that we are still a good portion, you could argue, are persuadable voters. So I get really frustrated by the time you say, oh, well, you know, we've never seen anything like this when we actually have. And what I liked about the town hall that Univision recently held with the Latino audience, there was that gentleman, I think his name was Ramiro, he's a construction worker out of New Jersey, who really took Trump to task. He walked him through 3 specific issues. But January 6th, I think that's one day that obviously will, to borrow words from the late great FDR, will live in infamy, right? How do you think that's going to factor in January 6th into voters? I haven't seen a whole lot of surveys that tackle that question. I know it's not popular with anyone, but as it relates to Latinos, have you seen any data that would lead you to believe that that's a sticking point?
Yeah, that's a great observation, and it ties, you know, directly into your overview of the Latino vote has moved over the years, and to remind people of that. So the person in that Univision town hall, Ramiro, he identified himself as a lifelong Republican. His Cuban heritage, was from New Jersey, lived in Florida at some point, and was very upset. He identified himself as financially conservative, but he was very upset at what had happened. And he asked a very direct question to former President Trump. And what did Trump say? He said, well, there was good patriotic Americans involved, and it was a day of love. And you could see just the disgust in his face, you know. And I think,
not to mention the women audience.
yeah, the one who gave him the eyes over here on
viral.
the side. You know, because we look at that with just such disdain and disbelief that for many of us whose families came from countries where there were not strong democracies, the United States was always this shining example, this beacon of hope of what democracy is supposed to be. And you follow laws and you have transition of power and you don't have the military marching on the streets. You know, my family is from South America, and at one point, I think Peru had 6 presidents in like 4 months, you know, and it was just like, that's just what happens there. You don't like one, you get rid of them, and another one comes in and there's a curfew. And so the United States and our support of democratic principles is a really, really big deal within the Latino community. The most patriotic support for the military community you're going to find. And when Trump just dismissed that January 6th, we have been seeing that as an issue, pop as an issue, that Latinos are upset about that was a bridge too far for them, that they were not willing to accept, you know, oh, okay, maybe he's a successful businessman, but, you know, I guess it's okay if he wants to be a dictator and use the military to go. No, they saw January 6th and they said, that's too much. And this man, Ramiro, gave him a chance to apologize and do better, and he didn't. He doubled down on it. And I think that's going to hurt him. People are not seeing that. You know, we have a new ad out. The Harris campaign has a new ad out featuring Aquilino Gonel, the Dominican U.S. naturalized citizen, U.S. Capitol sergeant, who was there and got pushed and aggressively attacked on January 6th. He is now strongly endorsing Harris. He spoke at the convention. And we have an ad featuring him and reminding Latinos what is at stake. Democracy is actually at stake this year. And for many Latinos, I think that hits a nerve.
No, I could not agree more. So my long-held belief, and Anthony will tell you that I sound like a broken record on this issue, I believe that women ultimately are going to determine the outcome of this election. Because, you know, it's hard, again, for me to relate to what they're going through. I've not been relegated to second-class citizenship while living in Texas, which is basically what's happening. It's not there only; it's throughout the South. Am I wrong to put too much? Am I putting too much stock in that? I say that because Gary would always say, you know, remember there's more women registered voters in this country. And so to me, it's like basic arithmetic, right? And for us, you know, like you, we have a daughter. In a few years, she'll be going off to college. Yeah. But there is no way on God's green earth we're going to let her go to Texas or, you know, one of these other states that has these archaic laws. So walk our audience through your thoughts on the electorate, specifically women.
Yeah, I think you're right. I don't think you're putting too much weight on that. As you point out, just from a data perspective, women do have higher voter registration rates than men. They are more likely by a couple percentage points to be in the electorate. They now have higher college going rates than men. And we know that it is, in particular, college educated people across the board, men and women, but women in particular, who are the most upset about what is happening with the rollback of reproductive freedoms and abortion rights. And so you put those sort of factors together. And if you continue looking at the data, the polling data that is out there across the board, it is Black women at the highest rates of support for Kamala Harris. It is Latinas, Hispanic women, number 2. All of this talk of the Latino vote. Hispanic women are very, very strong on Harris right now.
Right.
Asian American women as well. And she has, you know, been able to make strong connections into that community because of her mother. And white women then, who are the largest chunk, the largest absolute raw number of women, are shifting. Now, we've never seen a majority. We've never eclipsed 50% of white women voting for the Democratic Party. And think about that. all the Democrats that have ever won election are not winning because white men or white women are voting for them. It has become the strength of Black, Latino, Asian American, American Indian, and other votes. But we're at the precipice this year because we saw that in 22 with Dobbs. Exactly what you explained is what happened in 22. People predicted a red wave. People said, oh, the Democrats are in trouble. You know, people are upset about it. Exactly. And so I think you're right.
They're doing it again.
They are doing it again. And that's what still gives me a little bit of comfort is that when we see focus groups and data, we still see women very upset about the Supreme Court decision. And not just that, but they're now upset about Project 2025 and what Trump and other Republicans are promising to do. And that's why you're still seeing it featured prominently in ads. It's because it resonates and it is going to get women to the polls. They're going to outvote us men. And I think you're right that across every racial group, you're going to see an uptick in support for the Democratic ticket among women.
Well, along those lines, and I think I just briefly touched on it, Matt, you've already brought up the fact that white women have not exactly performed at the levels other women have within the Democratic Party. But, you know, we keep, and maybe, you know, here in Washington and just the political space in general, we tend to be in this bubble, and sometimes we forget that Twitter really is 2%. The problem is, I think that number is more pronounced among the political media, if you will, and they put a lot of stock into, you know, one could argue they're bogus polls that are out there, right? New polling firms that just were born, like literally within the last within the last few months, they're flooding the zone with polling that appears to be more favorable to Trump than.
These are places I've never even heard of, Albert. I look them up, and I've been in this business a long time. I've never even heard of these places, and you have to go. They have some sort of fly-by-night website.
Yeah.
With no, and they're releasing polls, and I think it's part of a strategy to try to introduce uncertainty and chaos into the cycle. As I said, like, how can in the same day you have polls, which we saw even from the New York Times, that they released about a month ago, that Harris was +5 in Pennsylvania and -6 in Arizona on the same day? I mean, these are both 1% states. That's just ridiculous. And that's the New York Times Siena poll. So what are they getting wrong? Let alone these others that come out. And one day Trump is +4 nationally. That's not possible that he's +4 nationally. But it goes into the polling average. And as to your point, it goes into the psyche of people on Twitter, and they talk about it and they get nervous. And I almost feel like we ought to have some sort of regulation on this. Of course, we need free speech and people should do research, but there should be some sort of, like, you've got to submit your polls to, you know, Real Clear Polling or to the New York Times Average. And someone's got to be a referee here and say, like, oh yeah,
that's for sure.
That's a legitimate one. That's a complete bunk garbage poll.
Let me ask this question. This is just kind of off the cuff, just kind of thinking about this. But I've maybe gotten in the past 2 weeks, I'm going to say conservatively, 15 text messages that have linked through to a poll. Is it possible that there's some polling fatigue from people? Like, I don't mind taking a survey. I don't mind doing it. Sure, I'm willing to help. I want,
Anthony, that would imply that you're like a swing voter. Is there something you want to? Are we breaking news here?
No, I'm just saying. It's like I know, but you don't know. Like, you don't know if some of these are legit. Some of these are fly by night, like you say, right? But is it possible at all though that that people are just tired of it and just you're not getting the right people that you want to get? And so that maybe it's a second subset of people or a third subset of people that you're trying to hit to get the numbers you need to make the poll happen.
Yeah, no, that's a really good point, because everyone is not just tired, perhaps at this point, of polling, but of the cycle in general, and not just those text message invites to polls, but all the text message invites you're getting to donate money or don't forget about this. And so I think you're right that because there is so much. People are getting exposed to this and they're a little bit tired of it. And so that makes it hard for the pollster to piece together the sample of the actual people who are going to show up on election day and who represent, so that you hope that that one person that you pull out and put in your poll, that they're representative of thousands of other people. And if the average person is too busy or disinterested, but they're still going to cast their vote, I need to somehow figure a way to pull them into my poll. I don't only want people who have absolutely nothing to do except wait for my message to come in and go, oh, I got the message and I'm going to take the poll. Like, that's not who I want. And so we need to figure that out. We need to sort of figure out, I've said before, you know, what if there was almost like a grand jury panel, you know, that there was sort of like a standing group of 5,000 citizens who agreed that once a month you could take our opinion and that we were representative of America. You know, something like that would be interesting. And academics have played around with stuff like that. But we do need to get better. We do need to get better at trying to make sure we have representative samples. And I think polling fatigue is real. I think people are, you know, as Albert said, they're ready for election day to be here. They're ready for it. We're all, you know, in the home stretch. But there will be another 100 polls between now and election day. So they're coming.
Another question on polling, Matt, that I get, and I'm not in a position to answer it because I'm not a certified pollster, but could you share with our audience what it means when they say, well, we're weighting a poll on this direction or the others? You hear often, well, pollsters are afraid that they're going to miss it, or they're giving Trump 5-6 points. What do they mean?
Sorry about that. I had some delivery, and you may have heard my dog there in the background, but I guess that's par for the course these days. You have to make sure that your sample reflects the true, what we call the true universe, the actual real people. And the single most important thing to get right, which we don't actually know the answer to, is the partisan makeup of the election on election day. How many Democrats, Republicans, independents are there going to be? Other things are a little bit more knowable because we can use things like the voter file that Target Smart supplies. We can use things like the US Census current population survey of voters. We know that we can get gender, age, things like that to what should be the correct. And so let's say you do a poll and young people don't want to answer it and you're off by 10 points. You should have 20% of your sample under the age of 30, but you only have 12. You then have to weight it so that instead of being 12%, they rise up and they're 20% of your sample. If you have 60% women, but you know it's only supposed to be 51, 52, you have to then push them down a little bit by only counting them as, you know, 85% of a response. So that when you tabulate, when your statistical program tabulates the data, there's the exact right number of people under 30, the exact right number of women, the exact right number of people college educated and people who didn't have a college degree. But most important in that, which is, of course, highly correlated with how you vote, is do you consider yourself a Democrat, a Republican, or something in the middle? And they should be waiting on that as well. In some places where party registration is on the voter file, we can look at it. We can go look at the voter file and say, oh, this state is 38% Democrat. But then we have to assume, is it going to be 38% Democrat on November 5th? And so that's another reason that all the rest of your poll can be good. Your data collection, your sampling, everything else can be good. Then it goes to someone like me, a data scientist, who has all of these other screens open that they look at. And then we have to weight the data. We have to say this response right here is going to count as 20% more of a response. This response over here is going to be 20% less of a response. And that's weighting your data. There's a whole scientific strategy on that. There's academic papers published. The US Census is probably the leading authorities on how to weight data. But you have to read that scholarly literature, you have to understand it, and you have to apply it correctly. And then at some point, you are guessing a little bit to say, well, I think Republican turnout is going to be 2% higher than everyone else thinks. So I'm going to give the Republicans a 2% weight on turnout. And that might be why your poll's coming out Trump +1. And so that's, you know, weighting your data and weighting it on getting the correct guess on what is the partisan affiliation on election day is probably the hardest thing for polls to do.
And that's why you do the election day part of the reason why.
that's a big reason why we do the election eve exit polls, that we want to make sure that we're getting it right, that we're interviewing voters as they go. So we're in the field right now. This is a product that we do every year with a number of partners that Albert was involved in for a couple of cycles, where we're, voting has started. I think we've got about 18 or 19% of the 2020 votes are already in right now. And so we're interviewing people. We're interviewing people who have admitted they've already voted. We can look at the voter file. We can call those people. We can text them and email them. And we're starting to collect data on what voters are telling us, real voters are telling us, by racial group, by state, et cetera. So that's a very, very important thing to do, so that you can actually talk to real voters.
Is that 18 or 19% of the 2020 or 2024 vote?
Of the 2020. So, of all the votes we had in 2020, somewhere around 18, 19% of all of those votes have already been cast right now. And that's going to keep ramping up every day.
Yeah.
Is there anything that you think has been underreported that you're finding, in your polling?
Yeah, I think that we assume every year, and the data bears this out, that each candidate, wins 95% of their co-partisans. So, and then the fight is over the independents and the leaners and the people in the middle. That 95% of Democrats, voted for Joe Biden in 2020, and 95% of Republicans voted for Donald Trump in 2020. It's somewhere around that, 93, 94 is bad. If it's really strong, 96, 97 is good. That you're getting your team with you. A big question we have this year, because we have Republicans for Kamala. A big question we have is, what's the peel off? You had John Kelly, former chief of staff, military general of Donald Trump, just within the last few days, talking about how he could never support him again because he constantly was talking about how he admired Hitler and that he meets the definition of a fascist. And so when you have these Republicans coming out as they are against Trump, the big question mark this year is, what is that peel-off rate going to be for the Harris campaign? Is it going to be around 10%? Could it exceed 10%? Could it be 12% of Republicans, of people?
That's a game.
That would decide the election. And we don't know
it's
that.
A wrap. If that happens, it's a wrap.
Yeah, if that happens, and you're seeing that, you've got, Liz Cheney, you've got many others who are out there campaigning on behalf of the vice president. But also that might just be happening in our communities, of people who are saying sort of, I've had enough. I don't need to see any more of this. And I'm going to go ahead and support. And Biden got some of those. He got some of those. But we're seeing many, many more as Trump ramps up his antics, which are just unhinged. More and more everyday average Republicans, including electeds, are coming out and saying that they will support Harris. So that's, I think, the big unknown. That's something that we're trying to track. It's not trackable unless you start interviewing actual voters and asking them what they're doing. And so we can look at the numbers from places like Target Smart, your Target Early, and we can see the number of modeled Republicans, but we don't know if some of those are actually voting for Harris. That's our suspicion, is that it could be closer to that 10% peel off this year than the sort of normal 5%. And we think that Trump has not done anything, and I don't think this is breaking news, to sort of woo over Democrats. If you're a Democratic identifier, probably 95% are going to stick with the Harris ticket. And so if Harris can peel off more Republicans, that will be game over.
Well, he's on the record saying he doesn't need Nikki Haley voters.
Yeah.
So
yeah, no, Trump is so much about himself that he only wants the hardcore Trump supporters, the MAGA supporters. And we know that there are lots of, going back to January 6th, Albert, we know there's lots of Republicans, not just the gentleman in the Univision town hall who said he was a Republican. Lots of Republicans who rightfully were disgusted by January 6th. Now, that most of them come home for economic and social policy reasons, but not all of them. Some of them are looking at what he's saying in Project 2025. So I think that's going to be something important to follow, to see, is there any movement there? Are some of those suburban college-educated Republicans who are going to vote Republican for Senate, for House, for their local county commissioner, who they might know, they're gonna not vote for Trump. That's what I'm expecting. And I think that if that happens, if what we're hearing materializes, it will be a better than expected night for Harris.
I don't remember what the peel-off number for Biden was 4 years ago. I'll have to look that up unless you know that off.
I don't, but it's typically somewhere in that 95 to 5% range. Maybe 93% to 7%, or you might get 93% of your co-partisans, but then maybe they voted for Jill Stein or someone else. So that doesn't hurt you as much as going directly to your opponent. But if you're only holding 90%, 88% of your base, that's not good. And usually by election day, the base comes home. But this year, we're seeing lots of signs that Republicans might still be skeptical of Trump.
And it's interesting that you point that out. And just to kind of make a correlation to the town hall that Vice President Harris did last night.
Yeah,
we've talked about this the last couple of weeks on this podcast, Matt. I live in Delaware County, Pennsylvania, just where this event took place last night. And Delaware County years ago was a wholly guaranteed red. It was going to be big time. You're going to always vote Republican. And then with the Obama years is when it started to switch over, and now it's predominantly blue. But there's still probably 45%. I'm going to say, I don't know what the exact number is, but about 45% of your registered voters in this county are still Republicans.
Yeah.
So there's a reason she's coming here.
Yeah.
She's probably going to win the county, but why are you doing that here in a spot you're going to win? Because there are still those Republican voters that maybe you can sway. And if you get a half a point or 1 point difference in this county, that could win you Pennsylvania.
Yeah, there's no question. And that's a great example. And first of all, that's why you're getting so many damn text invites to take surveys, because you live in Pennsylvania. You should have led with that. I think you're in the home of the most important battleground state this year.
Right.
And that's why Harris is there, though, because those are voters, and those Republican voters are voters who are open to hearing her message and who are frustrated by Trump's antics and his words and what he has promised, and just his over reliance on saying he's going to use the military to go after people, and that he's going to expand presidential powers. These are things that really scare people. And then when you look through the rearview mirror and you see January 6th there, you know that he's not joking around about that. And there's a reason that the man's own vice president is not supporting him. Now, there's a reason that the man's chief of staff is not supporting him, let alone these other 40 generals. These should be warning signs. And I think it's very smart for Harris to really emphasize that down the stretch and to remind people. If this was just any old, Republican candidate, you think the man's former vice president wouldn't support, his chief of staff wouldn't support him? These are the people who know him the best. They worked with him every day. And that is going to send, I think, alarm bells to people, not just there in Pennsylvania, but across the country. And that's why she's campaigning on that. And Albert, I looked it up while you were talking, and it was 94% in 2020, both. Biden won 94% of Democrats, according to the CNN exit poll crosstabs. Trump won 94% of Republicans. So they canceled each other out, those 6%. The question this year is, does that number dip into the low 90s for either candidate?
Well, only time will tell. I do have one last question, Matt, but we're running close to your deadline here, because I know you got real legit work to do. Not that this is not, but the Latino male, young Latino man,
yeah,
and young black man, it's on the news like every friggin'. It's like they put it on the loop. But I won't hammer too much on that. My suspicion, I think, I remember doing a paper with our old colleague Tom Schaller and Claudia from your shop,
yep,
Martinez, and there was some real analysis done on it. And what we found is that more than half of the Latino vote is residing in California, Texas, and Florida. So unlike African Americans, where their vote is sprinkled all throughout the battleground states, from Michigan to Pennsylvania to, with the exception maybe of Wisconsin, they have a strong presence pretty much everywhere. How do you think that contributes to some of the misses or the misgivings that, the talkers, if you will, that follow this regularly, to them not understanding the real, it's not a disparity, but it's just, and I don't want to use the redundant term that the talkers always use about that we're a monolith. It has nothing to do with being a monolith. It has everything to do with, the majority of Latinos in this country are Mexican American, like 2/3. Yet we don't make the effort to, tailor a message directly to, like, my nephews who are, they're college educated, but right now they're welding because they can make more money doing that on the oil rigs in Texas. So anyway,
I think you raise a really good point there. 2 points I think that we need to discuss. One is just the distribution of the population. So yes, Arizona, yes, Nevada, those are states that are over 25% Latino in terms of population and have big voting blocks. Somewhere around, 20% of the voters will be Latino in each of those two states. But after that, we have huge populations in places like California. We're going to be important here, where I live, in congressional races. In Texas, there's less competitive races this year, only a handful. New York, Illinois, and now Florida, which is not a presidential battleground this year, but certainly does have some competitive congressional. So you have, in those 5 states, the sort of big 5 states, you have a huge amount, something like 65 or 70%. I think it's 70% of all Latinos are just in those 5 states. And if those 5 states are not presidential battlegrounds, it does make it more difficult, and it does take away a little bit from, the voice in our community. But I think it's all the more important to then go to North Carolina, to go to Detroit, Michigan, and talk to the large Latino audience, which is there, and to make sure that they are part of the discussion and not overlooked, because we know those population numbers are growing, and they're getting larger, and that's how a state like Georgia eventually became well established as having a large Latino population in the Atlanta metro, not just the city, but in some of those outlying areas. And so we have to do that work to go there and meet Latinos in Wisconsin, in North Carolina, in Pennsylvania, not just in Philadelphia, but in the Lehigh Valley, and to realize there are hundreds of thousands of Latino voters in these other states besides California and Texas. But the last thing I'll say is don't give up on California and Texas, because those Latinos in California are going to be consequential on the House vote in probably 7 districts out here, at least 5, maybe as many as 7. And in Texas, as you and I have talked about for a long time, if and when the state Democratic Party of Texas is able to get the money, resources, and the focus to win over the Mexican American vote, register our community, and get them to the polls, then Texas is game over. The population is already there in Texas. It's already there. Yeah. They have to get registered and they have to get voting, and that's game over. And so I think those things are on the horizon. And at some point, Albert, you're going to go back to Texas, and you're going to go there because it's going to be a blue state, and that's going to happen in your lifetime.
There's too many people there now. Too many Californians. I get my fill with you. Well, Anthony, got any last minute gotcha questions for Matt?
No. Why am I the gotcha guy? Why am I the gotcha guy?
I don't know what happens.
You're in Pennsylvania. You might be one of those undecided. Maybe you're an undecided voter for all I know.
No, what it is, Matt, is Albert throws it to me for these because my background is in journalism. I've worked as a reporter for 25 years in the Philadelphia area, and I don't particularly like, canned questions. I like to listen to what you're saying and think of a question off the top of my head. And then, let's dive into it more. Let's get a little bit of more nuance. And so he puts me on the spot at the end of these podcasts.
Albert probably wrote all his questions down and practiced them for 4 hours. So let's hear something from you, Anthony, that's more interesting.
Exactly. No, I got nothing further today, Albert. I will pump the brakes here. We are pushing the 1 hour mark.
That's easy. I really appreciated it. And you guys have a great program here. It's great. And, the work you're doing, Albert, at Target Smart with Tom and the whole team has been very important to us understanding the electorate. And, we need to keep paying attention to that, see what's happening with the early vote. And you guys are really leading us in tracking the early vote. So thanks for your work, Albert.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah, well, thank you, Matt. We really appreciate you. And as always, I'll remind everyone, you can subscribe to the Target Smart podcast on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Pandora, Amazon Music, wherever you get your podcasts, or right here on YouTube. Hit that like button, subscribe. That does us great. And also, if you want to email the program, tell us what you think of our guests or what we should do in the future, email us at the Target Smart Podcast at targetsmart.com. So once again, thanks, Matt. Thanks, Albert. I'm Anthony. We'll see you again next week when we will be I think we'll be about 10 days out from the election by the time we do this next week. And holy smokes, are we getting close. So for Albert, I'm Anthony. Thanks for tuning in. We'll see you again next week.